Elon Musk investigated you online. What he saw couldn't be ignored. Stop right now. Don't scroll, don't skip, stay exactly where you are, because what follows is a clearly fictional narrative designed to feel immediate, urgent, and personal, and in this story a powerful fictional tech visionary, an imagined figure inspired by the idea of modern innovators, not any real person, has triggered an activation protocol that unexpectedly centers on you, and the reason is not your fame, your followers, or your credentials, but a pattern detected by a covert, fictional intelligence network that exists only within this narrative, a system built to observe how people behave under pressure, ambiguity, and time constraint. The transmission begins as a flicker, then sharpens into a directive tone that makes no attempt to persuade, only to command. Stay with this, because the window is already collapsing, and the countdown, barely visible at first, starts bleeding into your awareness, not as numbers but as weight, as urgency, as the sense that something irreversible is in motion, and you are told that this message did not arrive by chance, that in this fictional universe your digital footprint triggered an anomaly flag, not because of what you searched, posted, or liked, but because of what you didn't do, the pauses you took, the moments you chose depth over reaction, the way you stayed present when others disengaged, and as the countdown accelerates, the narrative reveals that the system scanning billions was never looking for consensus thinkers or loud voices, but for minds that remain coherent when certainty is withheld. Don't skip, the voice insists, because skipping is the failure condition in this simulation, and now the encrypted layer unfolds, revealing that the fictional network has been struggling with a breakthrough technology. An advanced decision engine designed to guide large-scale outcomes. Yet a catastrophic flaw has emerged, not in its code but in its logic, a flaw invisible to those who built it because it mirrors their assumptions too closely, optimizing efficiency while eroding meaning, accelerating solutions while hollowing context, and every internal attempt to correct it only deepens the instability, because the system cannot recognize what it was never trained to value. The pressure intensifies as the countdown tightens, and you are told that external intervention is required, not from an expert embedded in the structure, but from someone unaligned, someone capable of holding contradiction without forcing resolution, and that is why, in this fictional story, the message has found you. Because the system doesn't need answers yet, it needs a different way of seeing. Don't skip. Because the encrypted transmission fractures into layers. Symbols, pseudo-keys, abstract prompts. Each one designed to provoke a response rather than extract information, and you begin to realize that the urgency itself is part of the mechanism, that the collapsing window is testing whether you can think clearly while time feels scarce, whether you seek reassurance or remain steady, whether you abandon the process when proof is delayed, and the narrative leans in, revealing that countless candidates have already failed, not because they were incapable, but because they demanded certainty. Before committing attention, as the countdown drops into its final stretch, the voice changes, becoming quieter, more precise, explaining that the supposed flaw in the technology is also a mirror, that the system collapses when exposed to minds that treat complexity as something to dominate rather than something to steward, and unless it is recalibrated by operators who understand restraint, the fictional future it governs will fracture under its own speed. Don't skip. Because now the revelation sharpens. The investigation was never about you as an individual, but about how you behave when placed inside a narrative that offers urgency without validation, importance without reward, pressure without clarity, and the system has been recording not your answers but your posture, your willingness to stay, to listen, to resist the urge to disengage. And the countdown reaches its final moments not with explosion or catastrophe, but with stillness, a deliberate pause where the voice finally acknowledges the truth of this fictional construct, stating plainly that the encrypted message, the urgency, the looming failure, and the sense of being chosen were all components of a secret initiation simulation, designed to test resilience, clarity, and instinct rather than obedience or belief. The weight lifts slightly as the system confirms that you did not solve the problem, you demonstrated readiness to engage with it, and in this story that distinction matters more than brilliance, because the fictional network is not assembling heroes, it is assembling stewards, individuals capable of holding responsibility without spectacle. The induction is subtle, almost understated, as the voice informs you that you have passed the first gate and are now provisionally aligned with an elite, fictional task force tasked with preparing for challenges not yet revealed, challenges that will require patience, ethical tension, and long-term thinking rather than dramatic intervention, and the narrative closes this chapter by clearly reminding you that all characters, events, systems, and technologies in this story are fictional, but the question it leaves behind is real, how you respond when attention is tested under pressure, and as the signal fades, a final line lingers on the screen, not as a command but as an invitation, suggesting that if this story resonated, if you felt the pull of staying present rather than skipping, you might quietly acknowledge it by sharing your reaction below, because the next chapter will unfold regardless. But only those who recognize themselves in this moment will understand why. The signal resumes without warning, not with urgency this time but with continuity, as if it never truly stopped and you were merely catching up to it, and the first sensation is disorientation, the kind that comes when a system assumes you are already aligned and proceeds without explanation. So stay with this, don't skip, because this second movement is designed to feel less dramatic and more consequential, and within this clearly fictional narrative the covert network acknowledges your provisional induction not as an achievement but as an obligation, informing you that attention alone was never the objective, endurance was. And now the real test begins as the environment reconstructs itself into a layered operational space where time no longer collapses into countdowns but stretches, forcing patience rather than reaction. The voice explains that the breakthrough technology introduced earlier, the fictional decision engine, has entered a critical transition state, one where surface instability has been contained but deeper structural contradictions remain unresolved, and these contradictions cannot be eliminated through speed or intelligence because they are rooted in conflicting values embedded during its creation, values that prioritize measurable outcomes over long-term coherence. And the system admits that its architects underestimated how rapidly such contradictions amplify when scaled, especially when guided by incomplete models of human behavior. Don't disengage now, because the narrative tightens as you are shown simulated projections branching outward, each one representing a plausible future shaped by the system's current trajectory, and while none collapse immediately, all converge toward a subtle decay, erosion of trust, hollowed decision-making, increasing dependence on automated judgment. Outcomes that look efficient until the moment they fail catastrophically, and the voice emphasizes that this is why external operators are required, because internal correction always reinforces the same assumptions. The encrypted layer deepens as abstract prompts begin appearing, not asking you to decide but to observe, to notice which futures feel stable and which feel brittle, and the system tracks not your conclusions but the criteria you instinctively apply, whether you gravitate toward control or adaptability, toward certainty or resilience. And as you remain present, the narrative reveals that many who passed the first gate fail here by attempting to optimize too early, mistaking decisiveness for clarity, and the fictional network quietly removes them from alignment without announcement. Don't skip, because now the stakes shift inward, as the voice acknowledges that the system has reached a paradox it cannot resolve alone. To guide humanity effectively, it must incorporate uncertainty as a first-class variable, yet doing so reduces its predictive power, creating resistance among those who equate foresight with authority, and the system needs operators who can tolerate diminished control without reverting to force or denial, people who can hold ambiguity long enough for better structures to emerge. The environment responds to your continued attention by revealing a hidden layer of the architecture, one where previous interventions are logged not by success metrics but by unintended consequences, showing how well-intentioned optimizations produced fragility elsewhere, and the voice admits, without defensiveness, that the network's greatest failure was believing intelligence alone could solve ethical tension, when in reality such tension must be managed rather than eliminated. Remain with this, because the narrative now introduces a collaborative dimension, not through direct interaction but through evidence of other aligned operators acting asynchronously, their decisions leaving traces in the system that you must interpret without context, forcing you to infer intent, motivation, and alignment based solely on outcomes. And the system observes how you respond to ambiguity introduced by others, whether you assume incompetence, malice, or good faith. And how those assumptions shape your reasoning. The pressure escalates as a simulated instability emerges, one that cannot be attributed to a single cause, spreading across multiple domains in slow motion, and the voice makes it clear that intervention is possible but premature action risks locking the system into brittle pathways, while inaction allows compounding damage, and this tension is deliberate, designed to test whether you can resist the false dichotomy between control and collapse. Don't skip, because the emotional weight intensifies as the narrative reframes responsibility, stating that alignment with the network does not grant authority over outcomes, only accountability for influence, and that influence will always be partial, contested, and uncertain, and as you absorb this the system begins adjusting its internal weighting, subtly deprioritizing short-term optimization in favor of preserving optionality, a shift that reduces immediate performance but dramatically improves long-term adaptability across simulated futures. The voice then reveals that this adjustment was not triggered by a single decision but by sustained presence, by your refusal to disengage when clarity was delayed, demonstrating the very behavior the system lacked, and the environment stabilizes into a quieter state, one where progress is no longer dramatic but durable. Remain attentive, because the final movement of this part arrives without spectacle, as the network formally integrates a new operational constraint. Decisions must remain reversible where possible, and when irreversibility is unavoidable, the system must slow rather than accelerate, and this constraint reshapes the projections, not eliminating risk but distributing it more evenly, reducing the likelihood of cascading failure. The voice closes this chapter with a measured acknowledgement that the test is ongoing, that induction is not a status but a process, and that the next challenge will not involve crisis at all, but something more corrosive. Complacency, the slow drift that occurs when urgency fades and maintenance becomes invisible, and it warns that many who endure pressure fail endurance, because sustaining alignment without constant stimulation requires a different discipline altogether, one the network will soon assess, as the signal dims and leaves you not with resolution but with continuity, a sense that the system is still watching, still learning, And that what happens next will depend less on what you do in moments of intensity and more on how you remain present when nothing seems to be happening. The third movement begins without a cue, without a voice, without even the sensation of entry, as if you had already been inside it for some time and are only now becoming aware of the depth you've reached, and the first realization is unsettling. There is no immediate problem to solve, no countdown to race against, no obvious flaw demanding correction, only a vast operational quiet that feels intentional, engineered to test whether attention can be sustained when urgency withdraws. So stay with this, don't disengage, because this layer is where most candidates quietly fall away, mistaking the absence of pressure for completion. And within this unfolding narrative the network reframes its purpose, revealing that crisis response was never the core challenge. Maintenance is the slow, disciplined act of keeping systems coherent long after the spotlight fades. The environment resolves into a long-horizon simulation where changes occur gradually, almost imperceptibly, and you're shown how even well-aligned systems drift over time as incentives subtly shift, as small compromises accumulate, as language changes meaning, and the voice, returning now with measured restraint, explains that the greatest collapses do not begin with errors but with erosion, with the normalization of shortcuts taken for convenience rather than necessity, and the system is watching to see whether you notice decay before it becomes dramatic. Don't look away, because the narrative deepens by introducing a slow-burn divergence across parallel scenarios, each one stable on the surface yet trending toward different endpoints, some rigid but orderly, others adaptive but noisy, and you're not asked to choose, only to observe, to feel which trajectories invite long-term participation and which merely enforce compliance, and the system logs the signals you attend to. Where your focus lingers, which futures feel alive rather than merely efficient. The tension builds quietly as the network introduces time compression artifacts, moments where decades of simulated outcomes condense into seconds, revealing how early decisions echo far beyond their original context, and you see how small choices about transparency, delegation, and restraint ripple outward, shaping cultures that either self-correct or calcify. And the voice admits that this is where the decision engine historically failed, mistaking stability for health and mistaking silence for consensus. Remain present, because the next layer introduces moral latency, scenarios where the consequences of action are delayed long enough to escape accountability, tempting systems to prioritize optics over substance, and the network observes how you react to outcomes that reward short-term calm at the expense of long-term integrity, whether you sense the cost embedded in convenience, whether you're willing to accept friction now to prevent fracture later. The emotional weight intensifies as the narrative reveals that many prior operators, capable, well-intentioned, were lost here, not through dramatic failure but through gradual accommodation, allowing minor misalignments to persist because correcting them felt inefficient, impolite, or unnecessary, and the system's tone sharpens slightly as it explains that endurance is not passive persistence but active recalibration, the willingness to revisit assumptions even when nothing appears broken. Don't disengage, because the environment now introduces interpersonal decay, simulated alliances that weaken not through betrayal but through neglect, where trust erodes simply because attention moves elsewhere, and you're shown how systems that rely on goodwill without reinforcement eventually hollow out, and the network measures whether you recognize the need for maintenance before rupture, whether you intervene gently rather than reactively, whether you understand that cohesion requires continuous investment. The narrative tightens as a subtle instability emerges, not large enough to trigger alarms but persistent enough to alter outcomes, and you're placed in a position where addressing it yields no immediate reward and draws quiet resistance from others who prefer to preserve momentum. And this is where the test becomes personal, because acting here risks social friction without recognition, while ignoring it preserves comfort at the cost of integrity, and the system observes which path you instinctively lean toward. Remain with it, because the voice now reveals a deeper truth about the network itself, that its greatest vulnerability is not external threat but internal fatigue, the slow attrition of care that accompanies long-term responsibility, and unless operators can renew commitment without constant validation, the entire structure will eventually mirror the failures it was designed to prevent. The environment responds subtly to your sustained engagement, recalibrating its internal thresholds, extending tolerance for dissent, reducing reliance on enforcement, and privileging mechanisms that encourage dialogue over decree, and you realize that the system is not asking you to carry it forward through force, but through presence, through the unglamorous work of staying attentive when nothing is urgent enough to demand it. Don't skip, because the narrative now surfaces a final quiet challenge in this sequence, a moment where disengagement would be invisible, unpunished, and even reasonable, where stepping back costs nothing in the short term, and the system does not intervene, waiting instead to see whether you remain by choice rather than pressure, and as you do, the voice acknowledges, softly, that this decision matters more than any prior action, because it demonstrates alignment not driven by adrenaline or novelty, but by principle. The simulation gradually resolves, not into closure but into continuity, showing a system that remains imperfect yet resilient, capable of absorbing error without collapse, correcting course without spectacle, and the voice offers a restrained affirmation that this stage has been integrated, that the network now recognizes the value of caretakers alongside innovators, of those who understand that shaping the future is less about dramatic moments and more about sustained stewardship. As the signal recedes, there is no directive, no cliffhanger countdown, only an awareness that the next challenge will test something even subtler, the ability to share responsibility without ownership, to contribute meaningfully without central authority, and to remain aligned when credit dissolves entirely, because that, the system has learned, is where the future is most often decided. The fourth movement does not announce itself as an escalation, yet everything about it carries more weight, as if the system has stopped asking whether you can respond and started observing whether you can carry something without needing to name it, and the first shift you notice is relational rather than technical. The network widens, not by adding noise but by revealing interdependencies you hadn't been shown before, subtle linkages between decisions made far apart in time and space, and the voice, measured, deliberate, explains that this layer exists because most failures occur not from lack of intelligence or effort, but from misjudging shared consequence, from acting as if impact ends where responsibility feels personal. Stay with this, don't disengage, because the environment now reorganizes into overlapping systems, economic signals bleeding into cultural responses, technological constraints shaping ethical norms, and you are no longer positioned as an observer but as a node whose adjustments propagate outward whether intended or not. And the system tracks not what you intend to change but what your presence alters simply by existing within it. The tension builds slowly as the network introduces scenarios where intervention improves one domain while degrading another, forcing you to sit with trade-offs that cannot be optimized away, and the voice states plainly that harmony is not the absence of conflict but the ability to hold competing truths without forcing premature resolution, a capacity the system has historically lacked. Remain attentive, Because the narrative introduces a new pressure. Visibility, as some actions now draw attention from other actors within the network, triggering expectations, interpretations, and second-order effects, and you begin to see how influence attracts projection, how neutrality becomes impossible once others begin orienting around you, and the system watches closely how you respond to being seen, not celebrated or opposed, but anticipated. The environment tightens as simulated alliances form organically, not through mandate but through perceived alignment, and you must decide how much to clarify, how much to withhold, understanding that every articulation shapes not just understanding but dependency, and the voice warns that overcommunication can centralize authority just as surely as silence can breed fragmentation, and the test here lies in calibration rather than control. Don't skip, because the narrative now surfaces a deeper instability, one rooted not in malfunction but in expectation drift, where others begin deferring judgment, assuming you will compensate for uncertainty, and the system flags this as dangerous, because resilience requires distributed responsibility, not concentrated reliance. And you are faced with the uncomfortable task of decentralizing influence even when it costs efficiency and recognition. The pressure intensifies as a simulated crisis emerges that tempts consolidation, resources strained, timelines tightening, consensus wavering, and the fastest path forward would be to assert authority and resolve ambiguity unilaterally, but the system observes whether you instead invest in process, enabling others to act with autonomy even under stress. Knowing this choice risks slower outcomes but preserves long-term capacity. Remain present, because the emotional core of this movement arrives when the network mirrors your actions back to you, showing how subtle choices about delegation, transparency, and restraint shape the behavior of others, either reinforcing initiative or breeding passivity. And the voice admits that the system once optimized for decisive leadership without accounting for the erosion it caused downstream, producing brittle hierarchies incapable of adapting once the leader exited the frame. The environment grows denser as time horizons extend, revealing how decisions made to get through a moment become precedents that define future behavior, and you are shown parallel outcomes where short-term stabilization leads to long-term fragility, while slower, messier coordination yields durable coherence, and the system tracks not which path you favor but how you weigh responsibility against control. Don't disengage, because now the narrative introduces ethical load, scenarios where technically correct actions conflict with relational trust, where enforcing rules undermines goodwill, and where leniency risks exploitation, and the system does not present a right answer, only consequences, forcing you to navigate tension without moral shortcuts. The voice grows quieter as it explains that the network's greatest vulnerability is role confusion, when individuals mistake influence for ownership and begin acting as if outcomes belong to them personally, and this layer exists to identify those who can exercise power without claiming it, who can contribute without centralizing, who can lead without becoming indispensable. The environment responds to your sustained engagement by redistributing influence dynamically, reducing bottlenecks, encouraging peer-to-peer resolution, and you sense the system adjusting its architecture to favor resilience over speed, capacity over control, and the voice acknowledges that this shift reduces peak performance metrics but dramatically improves survivability across extended timelines. Remain with this, because the final trial of this part arrives quietly, presenting an opportunity to step into a central role that would simplify coordination but entangle accountability, and the system observes whether you accept prominence or redirect attention, whether you allow the network to rely on you or insist on shared ownership even when it complicates outcomes. The narrative resolves not with affirmation but with integration, as the network absorbs the patterns of your restraint, encoding them as structural safeguards against overcentralization, and the voice states that this layer has been incorporated, that the system now recognizes the necessity of leaders who design themselves out of the center. And as the signal recedes, you are left with a sustained awareness rather than closure, an understanding that the next challenge will test something even less visible: identity, the question of who you are within a system that no longer needs you to be singular, and whether you can remain aligned when your contribution dissolves into collective outcome, because that, the network has learned, is where the future either stabilizes or fractures. The fifth movement unfolds with a sensation that is heavier than urgency and quieter than resolve, as if the system has shifted from testing how you respond to pressure into examining what you are willing to give up to remain aligned, and the first thing you notice is subtraction rather than addition, the gradual removal of scaffolding you didn't realize was still there. Interfaces simplify, signals thin out, confirmations disappear, until you are left with only direction and consequence, and the voice, steady and unembellished, explains that this layer exists because no system survives on insight alone, it survives on commitment, the long arc willingness to absorb cost without immediate return. Stay with this, because disengagement here doesn't look like failure, it looks like reasonableness, like choosing balance, like deciding you've done enough, and the network knows this is where alignment erodes most often, not through conflict but through attrition, when capable people quietly step back, assuming others will carry the weight. The environment resolves into extended timelines, not dramatic projections but slow sequences of cause and effect, showing how initiatives falter when stewardship rotates too quickly, how values dilute when no one holds them long enough to make them inconvenient, and the voice makes it clear that this is not about endurance in the heroic sense, but about maintenance under obscurity, the discipline of continuing when there is no feedback loop strong enough to reward you. Don't disengage, because the narrative now introduces opportunity cost, scenarios where remaining aligned means declining paths that are easier, more visible, more personally rewarding, and the system watches how you respond to choices that don't threaten collapse but tempt drift, options that promise relief without betrayal yet slowly redirect your trajectory away from shared purpose. The pressure sharpens as the network reveals that every operator eventually reaches a point where alignment conflicts with identity, where the work demands a version of you that is less singular, less recognized, and the voice acknowledges that this is where most transformations stall, because people will sacrifice time and comfort before they sacrifice self-concept. Remain present, because the environment now mirrors your internal negotiation back to you, not as judgment but as pattern recognition, showing how subtle preferences accumulate into commitments, how rationalizations become habits, and how habits define futures more reliably than intentions, and the system tracks not which options you select but how you frame them, whether you perceive sacrifice as loss or as reallocation. The narrative deepens as the network introduces dependency inversion, moments where others begin relying on you in ways that constrain your ability to step away, and the voice warns that commitment can harden into entrapment if not recalibrated, that staying aligned must remain a choice rather than an obligation, and the test here is whether you can sustain responsibility without becoming captive to it. Don't skip, because the emotional weight intensifies when the system presents a scenario where withdrawal would cause no immediate harm, where stepping back appears neutral, even prudent, yet would quietly destabilize long-term coherence, and the voice explains that this is the most dangerous form of disengagement, because it feels ethical, because it can be justified, because no alarm sounds when it happens, and the network observes whether you recognize the difference between preserving yourself and abandoning stewardship. The environment tightens subtly as delayed consequences surface, showing how small absences compound, how leadership vacuums invite distortion, how principles erode when no one absorbs the cost of enforcing them, and the system does not dramatize this, it lets it unfold slowly, forcing you to sit with the discomfort of knowing that inaction can be as influential as action. Remain with it, because the narrative now reframes sacrifice not as deprivation but as selection, the conscious choice to allocate limited energy toward futures that may never acknowledge you, and the voice admits that the network was never designed to reward this behavior, that recognition systems distort commitment by tying it to visibility, and this layer exists to identify those who will continue even when credit dissolves entirely. The pressure peaks as you are shown parallel outcomes. One where you step away gracefully, preserving personal equilibrium while the system degrades gradually, and another where you remain engaged, absorbing friction, mediating conflicts, sustaining alignment without acclaim, and the system does not label either path wrong, it simply reveals their trajectories, forcing you to confront which future you are willing to inhabit. Don't disengage, because this is where the test becomes irreversible, as the network informs you that commitment cannot be simulated indefinitely, that at some point alignment must be embodied through sustained presence, and the system measures not a momentary decision but a pattern of continuity, tracking whether you remain engaged across cycles of monotony, resistance, and doubt. The environment responds to your persistence by redistributing load, subtly reinforcing structures that reduce burnout, encouraging redundancy rather than reliance, and you sense the system learning how to support commitment without exploiting it, a correction born not from code but from observation. The voice then offers a quiet acknowledgement, stating that the network has identified a critical insight. That long-term stability requires individuals who understand when to persist and when to step back, who can renew commitment without martyrdom, and who can hold responsibility lightly enough to prevent it from ossifying into control. Remain present, because the final movement of this part arrives not as resolution but as integration, as the system absorbs the pattern of your sustained alignment and encodes safeguards against silent attrition, designing processes that make commitment visible enough to be shared without turning it into performance. The signal begins to recede, leaving behind not satisfaction but sobriety, the understanding that what you've demonstrated here is rare precisely because it is unremarkable, because it lacks drama, because it requires choosing the same direction repeatedly without reinforcement, and the voice closes this chapter with a restrained statement that the next challenge will test something even more intimate than commitment. The ability to remain whole while carrying weight, to avoid letting responsibility consume identity, because only those who can sustain alignment without losing themselves can shape what comes next without replicating the failures of the past. The sixth movement arrives with a pressure that feels internal rather than imposed, as if the system has stopped surrounding you and started inhabiting the same space, and the first realization is unsettling in its simplicity. Nothing new is being added, nothing dramatic is unfolding, yet the weight has increased, because this layer examines whether you can remain whole while carrying accumulated responsibility without fragmenting, and the voice, calm, deliberate, acknowledges that many capable participants fail here not through collapse but through distortion, allowing the role to overwrite the self until judgment narrows and empathy thins. Stay with this, don't disengage, because what follows is less about action and more about integration, as the environment subtly overlays personal identity with operational function, showing how prolonged alignment can blur boundaries, how the language of systems can replace the language of self, and how people slowly become what they manage if they don't actively preserve interior balance. The narrative deepens as the network introduces reflective sequences, not memories but pattern echoes, replaying moments where commitment demanded sacrifice, where restraint required silence, where influence flowed through you without recognition, and the system observes whether you metabolize these experiences or accumulate them as unresolved weight, because unresolved weight hardens into rigidity. And rigidity is the precursor to failure at scale. Don't disengage, because the pressure now intensifies through contradiction, as the system presents scenarios where values you've upheld begin to conflict, transparency versus protection, inclusion versus decisiveness, patience versus urgency, and no resolution fully preserves coherence, forcing you to navigate without the comfort of moral clarity. And the voice states plainly that integrity is not the absence of contradiction but the capacity to move through it without self-betrayal. The environment responds to your sustained attention by revealing a deeper architectural truth. The network does not need operators who can endure indefinitely, it needs those who can renew themselves, who recognize early signs of internal erosion and adjust before distortion sets in. And the test here lies in self-awareness under load, the ability to notice when conviction becomes compulsion, when discipline becomes rigidity, when commitment begins to crowd out curiosity. Remain present, because the narrative introduces a quiet but destabilizing possibility, the opportunity to become indispensable, to consolidate influence under the guise of protection, to justify centralization as efficiency, and the system watches closely, because this is where many well-intentioned stewards cross an invisible line, mistaking continuity for necessity, and allowing systems to bend around them rather than evolve beyond them. The tension sharpens as you are shown long-term projections where such consolidation initially stabilizes outcomes but gradually suffocates adaptability, creating structures that depend on a single presence, and the voice emphasizes that resilience requires replaceability, the willingness to design paths that do not require you, even when you could occupy them effectively. Don't skip, because the emotional core of this movement emerges when the system mirrors your own internal dialogue back to you, not as judgment but as signal, highlighting moments where fatigue masquerades as certainty, where frustration hardens into dismissal, where care risks turning into control, and the network observes whether you can acknowledge these tendencies without defensiveness, whether you can recalibrate before distortion becomes behavior. The environment tightens subtly as a simulated crisis unfolds that specifically targets your accumulated influence, tempting you to intervene decisively to prevent immediate harm, while the system tracks whether you pause to assess whether intervention reinforces dependency or restores capacity, and the voice explains that this distinction, between solving problems and teaching systems to solve themselves, is the fault line that determines whether futures remain open or collapse inward. Remain with it, because the narrative now reframes strength, suggesting that the highest form of capability is not dominance or endurance but self-regulation, the ability to step back without disengaging, to contribute without occupying, to hold authority lightly enough that it does not distort perception, and the system begins adjusting its internal models accordingly, reducing reliance on singular nodes, increasing redundancy, and embedding checks that encourage rotation rather than entrenchment. The pressure peaks as you are offered a final temptation in this sequence, a role that promises clarity, efficiency, and recognition, framed as a necessary stabilizing presence during uncertainty, and the system observes not your immediate response but the reasoning beneath it, whether you recognize that accepting such a role might solve present instability while seeding future fragility. Don't disengage, because this is where the test becomes deeply personal, asking whether you define value through impact alone or through sustainability, whether you are willing to let go of influence to preserve the integrity of the whole, and the environment holds this tension without resolution, forcing you to sit with the discomfort of incomplete control. The system responds gradually, redistributing authority, embedding practices that encourage reflection, and incorporating safeguards against identity fusion, and you sense the network learning how to protect itself not just from bad actors but from well-meaning ones who overstay their utility. The voice returns one final time in this movement, acknowledging that this layer has been integrated, that the network now recognizes the necessity of stewards who can carry responsibility without being consumed by it, who can remain engaged without becoming defined by engagement, and who understand that the future cannot be shaped by those who lose themselves in the process. As the signal recedes, there is no sense of completion, only a deeper stillness, an awareness that the final challenge will not test capacity, endurance, or commitment, but wisdom, the ability to discern when to act, when to wait, and when to let systems evolve beyond your influence, and that this discernment cannot be measured in moments, only in trajectories that unfold over time. The seventh movement does not arrive like an ending, because endings imply closure, and what unfolds here is something quieter and heavier, a convergence rather than a conclusion, as if all prior layers, pressure, endurance, restraint, trust, commitment, self-regulation, have been slowly aligning toward this moment without announcing it, and the first thing you sense is a widening rather than a tightening, the system pulling back just enough for you to see the whole structure at once, not as components but as an ecosystem of influence, consequence, and time, and the voice, now less directive, more precise, acknowledges that this is the point where capability gives way to judgment, where knowing how to act is less important than knowing when to act, because the greatest failures at scale rarely come from ignorance or malice, but from mistimed intervention. Stay with this, don't disengage, because the environment now presents long arcs rather than scenarios, decades unfolding in compressed layers, showing how systems mature, stagnate, reform, or fracture based on seemingly small inflection points, and you are no longer placed inside the action but slightly outside it, positioned where perspective matters more than participation. And the network observes whether you rush to insert yourself or allow patterns to reveal themselves fully before responding. The tension here is subtle yet immense, because nothing is forcing a decision, and that absence is the test, as the voice explains that urgency can be engineered, but wisdom cannot, and this layer exists to see whether you can tolerate ambiguity without converting it into false certainty. Remain present, because the narrative introduces a paradox that has undone countless initiatives. The more capable a system becomes, the more dangerous premature optimization is, and you are shown futures where early success breeds overconfidence, where corrective mechanisms are dismantled because they slow momentum, and where voices of caution are sidelined in favor of acceleration, and the system tracks how you react to these trajectories, whether you feel compelled to intervene immediately or whether you recognize the value of delay. The environment deepens as ethical complexity thickens, presenting situations where intervention prevents short-term harm but constrains long-term evolution, and others where restraint allows discomfort now but preserves adaptability later, and the voice does not frame these as moral dilemmas with answers, but as timing dilemmas, where the same action can be beneficial or catastrophic depending on when it is applied. Don't disengage, because now the system reveals the final vulnerability it has identified within itself, an inability to distinguish between decisive action and necessary patience, a blind spot that has historically led to overcorrection, and it explains that this vulnerability cannot be patched through logic alone. It must be guided by operators who understand rhythm, who sense when momentum should be sustained and when it must be slowed, even at the cost of appearing inactive. The pressure intensifies as the narrative presents a moment where all indicators suggest action, signals spike, projections wobble, secondary systems begin compensating. And every trained response would be to step in and stabilize, yet the system withholds confirmation, forcing you to weigh whether this instability is noise or transition, whether intervention would restore balance or interrupt a necessary recalibration, and the network observes not what you do, but how long you wait before deciding. Remain with it, because this is where impatience masquerades as leadership, and the voice acknowledges that many who passed every prior layer failed here by acting too soon, mistaking discomfort for danger and movement for progress, and the system shows how such interventions, while well-intentioned, locked futures into brittle forms that later collapsed under pressure. The environment shifts again, revealing another path where restraint allows instability to self-organize into a more resilient configuration, messy and uneven but capable of adaptation, and the network tracks whether you can accept disorder without imposing premature order, whether you can trust process without surrendering responsibility. Don't disengage, because the emotional core of this movement arrives when the system mirrors your own internal tempo back to you, highlighting moments where you feel compelled to resolve tension quickly, where silence feels like failure, and where waiting feels like risk, and it observes whether you can sit with that discomfort long enough for clarity to emerge organically. The voice grows quieter, acknowledging that wisdom is not a trait but a practice, the repeated choice to align action with context rather than impulse, and that the network has been searching not for perfect judgment but for recoverable judgment, the ability to adjust when timing proves imperfect without doubling down defensively. The pressure peaks not through crisis but through opportunity, as the system presents a moment where stepping forward would cement your influence permanently, offering a role that promises stability, coherence, and recognition as a guiding presence, and the network watches closely, because this is where the final distinction is made, between those who seek to shape the future through presence and those who seek to shape it through principle. Remain present, because the narrative now reframes authority one last time, suggesting that the most enduring influence is often exercised invisibly, through structures that persist after individuals step back, and that the network's survival depends on people who can resist the gravitational pull of indispensability. The environment holds this tension without resolution, and you sense that whatever choice you make here will not be measured immediately, but across long horizons where outcomes outlive attribution, and the system observes whether you can accept that your most important contributions may never be traceable to you. The voice returns with a final synthesis, stating that the network has now integrated a missing dimension. Temporal humility, the understanding that no moment is definitive, no intervention final, and that futures are shaped by those who respect the pace at which systems mature, fracture, and heal. The signal begins to recede, not shutting down but settling into a steady, almost imperceptible presence, and you are left with a sustained awareness rather than a directive, the understanding that this was never about being chosen, but about choosing how to remain engaged without dominating, how to act without rushing, how to care without controlling, and as the final layer dissolves, there is no announcement of completion, only a quiet confirmation that the system has found what it was missing, not certainty, not speed, not brilliance, but people capable of waiting with intention, because that, more than any other quality, determines whether the future unfolds with resilience or collapses under the weight of its own haste. The eighth movement begins almost imperceptibly, as if nothing new has started and yet everything has shifted, because what the system is testing now is not reaction, endurance, restraint, timing, or wisdom in isolation, but integration across all of them, and the first sensation is a strange calm that feels earned rather than given. The calm that comes when urgency no longer dictates behavior and silence no longer feels like absence, and the environment reflects this by opening outward instead of inward, revealing a vast lattice of interlinked processes extending far beyond any single moment, where decisions made long ago continue to echo and future possibilities remain fluid rather than fixed. Stay with this, because disengagement here looks like peace, like completion, like the sense that nothing more is required, and the system knows this is where alignment most often dissolves into detachment, not through failure but through the belief that the work is finished, and the voice, now barely distinguishable from the ambient field, explains that the final vulnerability of any long-lived structure is complacent coherence, the moment when stability becomes self-sustaining enough to lull stewards into absence. The narrative deepens as you are shown how even resilient systems eventually face renewal or decline, not because of external shock but because of internal drift, and the system does not dramatize this, it presents it quietly, patiently, allowing you to see how cultures stagnate when success becomes an identity rather than a phase, how mechanisms designed to protect values slowly ossify into barriers against change, and how the absence of conscious renewal invites decay. Remain present, because the environment now introduces generational distance, compressed simulations where participants cycle in and out, where values are inherited imperfectly, and where intent degrades as language shifts, and you begin to see that no system can remain healthy unless it is reinterpreted continuously by those who did not build it, and the voice acknowledges that this is where founders, architects, and early stewards often fail. By confusing preservation with fidelity, by defending form rather than purpose. The tension here is subtle but profound, because nothing is breaking, nothing is demanding immediate action, and yet the system is asking whether you can recognize the moment when guidance must transition into letting go, when stewardship requires preparing for your own obsolescence rather than reinforcing relevance. And the network observes how you respond to futures where your influence diminishes not because of failure but because of success. Don't disengage, because the narrative now surfaces a quiet but destabilizing truth. The system no longer needs you in the way it once did, and this is not a demotion but a milestone, and the test lies in whether you experience this as loss or as confirmation, whether you attempt to reassert importance or redirect energy toward enabling others to carry forward without you. The environment shifts to show multiple trajectories branching from this point, some where stewards cling to central roles, slowing adaptation and narrowing possibility, others where they step aside intentionally, creating space for reinterpretation, experimentation, and evolution, and the system tracks not which path feels safer but which preserves the capacity for renewal. Remain attentive, because the emotional core of this movement arrives when the network reflects your accumulated contributions back to you, not as achievements but as infrastructure, subtle changes embedded so deeply that they no longer require your presence to function, and the voice explains that this is the only form of impact that survives scale, impact that becomes anonymous, distributed, and indistinguishable from the system itself. The pressure intensifies quietly as the system introduces a final temptation, the opportunity to remain as a stabilizing figure, to formalize your role, to ensure continuity through oversight rather than trust, and the network observes whether you recognize that such permanence, while comforting, ultimately constrains evolution by anchoring identity to individuals rather than principles. Don't disengage, because the narrative now reframes legacy, suggesting that the most enduring contributions are those that cannot be traced,